Sometimes, the most defining moments in life come when we least expect them. Moments that test our character, our courage, and our humanity. This is one of those stories, a tale of injustice, courage, and the unexpected twists of fate. So, sit back and let's dive into a story that will leave you questioning the world we live in. And hey, if you're enjoying this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more gripping tales like this one. The sound of roaring motorcycle engines echoed through the quiet streets of Windsor, a small town near London known for its royal history. The biker gang, known as the Iron Skulls, was a notorious group of men who thrived on chaos and intimidation. They were led by a man named Vince Viper Harper, a towering figure with a shaved head, a thick beard, and a permanent scowl etched on his face. Vince was the kind of man who believed the world owed him something, and he took what he wanted, no questions asked. His gang followed him blindly, feeding off his anger and hatred. On this particular day, the Iron Skulls had decided to ride through Windsor, their loud engines and aggressive demeanor turning heads and causing unease among the townsfolk. They didn't care. In fact, they loved the attention. But what they didn't know was that this ride would change their lives forever. As they approached the gates of Windsor Castle, they noticed a lone figure standing guard. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in the iconic red uniform and bearskin hat of the Royal Guard. His name was Humphrey Johnson, a 28-year-old soldier who had dedicated his life to serving his country. Humphrey was proud of his role, but he was no stranger to the stares and whispers that followed him wherever he went. As a black man in a predominantly white institution, he had faced his fair share of racism and prejudice. But he never let it break him. He stood tall, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The bikers slowed down as they approached Humphrey, their engines growling like wild beasts. Vince revved his bike, the sound piercing the air like a gunshot. He smirked as he saw Humphrey flinch slightly, but the guard quickly regained his composure. Vince didn't like that. He didn't like being ignored. "Why, mate," Vince called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's a bloke like you doing in a fancy uniform like that? You lost or something?" Humphrey didn't respond. He continued to stare straight ahead, his hands gripping his rifle tightly. But Vince wasn't done. He got off his bike and walked up to Humphrey, his gang following close behind. They formed a semicircle around the guard, their presence intimidating. "I'm talking to you," Vince said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're better than us, don't you? Standing there all high and mighty like some kind of king." Humphrey remained silent, but his jaw tightened. He knew better than to engage with men like Vince. But Vince wasn't looking for a conversation. He was looking for a reaction. Without warning, Vince slapped Humphrey across the face. The sound echoed through the air, sharp and brutal. Humphrey stumbled back slightly, his hat falling to the ground. The bikers laughed, their voices cruel and mocking. Vince leaned in close, his breath hot against Humphrey's face. "That's what happens when you don't know your place," Vince sneered. "You're nothing but a—" But before he could finish his sentence, a voice cut through the air like a knife. "That's enough." The bikers turned around, their laughter dying in their throats. Standing a few feet away was a woman in her late 90s, her silver hair neatly styled, her eyes sharp and piercing. She wore a simple but elegant coat, and her presence commanded respect. It was Queen Elizabeth II. The bikers froze. Vince's smirk disappeared, replaced by a look of shock and fear. He had no idea the Queen was watching. None of them did. The Queen stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Vince. "How dare you," she said, her voice calm but filled with authority. "How dare you treat one of my guards in such a manner?" Vince opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The Queen turned to Humphrey, her expression softening. "Are you all right, soldier?" she asked. Humphrey nodded, his voice steady despite the humiliation he had just endured. "Yes, Your Majesty. Thank you." The Queen turned back to Vince and his gang, her eyes narrowing. "You will leave this place at once," she said. "And if I ever see you near Windsor Castle again, you will regret it." The bikers didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled onto their bikes and sped off, their engines roaring as they disappeared into the distance. Vince glanced back once, his face pale, his hands trembling on the handlebars. He knew he had messed up. Big time. As the sound of the bikes faded, the Queen turned to Humphrey once more. "You are a credit to this country," she said. "Never forget that." Humphrey nodded, his heart swelling with pride. But as he watched the Queen walk away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Vince and his gang were dangerous men, and they wouldn't take this humiliation lightly. Little did Humphrey know, this was just the beginning of a chain of events that would test his courage, his resilience, and his faith in justice. The Queen's intervention had saved him for now, But the storm was far from over. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over Windsor Castle. Humphrey stood at his post, his face still stinging from the slap he had received earlier. He tried to push the memory aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. But it was hard. The humiliation burned in his chest, a constant reminder of the injustice he had faced. As he stood there, his mind wandered back to his childhood. Humphrey had grown up in a small town in the Midlands, the son of Jamaican immigrants who had come to the UK in search of a better life. His parents had worked tirelessly to provide for him and his siblings, instilling in them the values of hard work, respect, and resilience. Humphrey had always been proud of his heritage, but he had also faced his fair share of challenges. Racism was a constant presence in his life, from the playground to the workplace. But he had never let it define him. He had always strived to rise above it, to prove that he was more than the color of his skin. Joining the military had been a dream come true for Humphrey. It was a chance to serve his country, to make a difference, and to prove himself in a way that no one could deny. But even here, in the hallowed halls of Windsor Castle, he had encountered prejudice. Some of his fellow guards had made snide remarks, questioning his place in the ranks. But Humphrey had always held his head high, determined to show that he belonged. As the night wore on, Humphrey's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. He turned to see a fellow guard, a man named Tommy Briggs, walking towards him. Tommy was a few years older than Humphrey, with a friendly face and a quick wit. He had been one of the few people who had welcomed Humphrey with open arms when he first joined the guard. "Hey Humphrey," Tommy said, his voice filled with concern. "I heard what happened earlier. Are you okay?" Humphrey nodded, though his eyes betrayed the turmoil he was feeling. "I'm fine," he said. "Just another day in the life, right?" Tommy frowned. "Don't give me that," he said. "What those guys did was wrong. You shouldn't have to put up with that kind of crap." Humphrey sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I know," he said. "But what can I do? They're just a bunch of thugs. They're not worth my time." Tommy shook his head. "Maybe not," he said. "But that doesn't mean you should let them get away with it. You're a royal guard, Humphrey. You deserve respect." Humphrey smiled faintly, grateful for Tommy's support. But deep down, he knew that respect wasn't something that could be demanded. It had to be earned. And in a world where people like Vince Harper existed, that was easier said than done. As the two guards stood there, a sudden noise caught their attention. It was the sound of a motorcycle engine, faint but unmistakable. Humphrey's heart skipped a beat. He turned towards the sound, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice tense. Tommy nodded, his expression grim. "Yeah," he said. "Sounds like they're back." The sound grew louder, closer. Humphrey's grip tightened on his rifle, his mind racing. What were they doing here? Had they come back to finish what they started? Before he could react, a group of motorcycles emerged from the shadows, their headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. It was the Iron Skulls, led by Vince Harper. But this time they weren't alone. There were more of them, at least a dozen, their faces hidden behind helmets and masks. Humphrey's heart pounded in his chest as the bikers came to a stop just a few feet away from him. Vince got off his bike, his eyes locked on Humphrey. There was a cold, calculating look in his eyes, one that sent a shiver down Humphrey's spine. Well, Vince said, his voice dripping with malice. "Look who's still standing guard. You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Humphrey didn't respond. He stood his ground, his eyes never leaving Vince's. He could feel Tommy beside him, tense and ready for whatever was about to happen. Vince took a step closer, his gang following suit. "You think you're tough, don't you?" he said. "You think just because the Queen stepped in you're untouchable. But let me tell you something, mate. No one messes with the Iron Skulls and gets away with it." Humphrey's mind raced. He knew he was outnumbered, outgunned. But he couldn't back down. "Not now. Not ever. What do you want?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. Vince smirked. "What do I want?" he repeated. "I want you to pay. I want you to know what happens when you mess with the wrong people." Before Humphrey could react, Vince lunged at him, his fist connecting with Humphrey's jaw. The force of the blow sent Humphrey stumbling back, his rifle slipping from his grasp. Tommy tried to intervene, but one of the bikers grabbed him, holding him back. Humphrey struggled to his feet, his vision blurry. He could hear the bikers laughing, their voices cruel and mocking. But he refused to give up. He refused to let them win. As Vince raised his fist again, Humphrey braced himself for the impact. But before the blow could land, a loud voice rang out. "Stop." The bikers froze, their heads turning towards the source of the voice. Standing a few feet away was a group of armed soldiers, their weapons trained on the bikers. At the front of the group was a man in his 40s, his face stern and unyielding. It was Colonel James Whitaker, the head of security at Windsor Castle. "Drop your weapons," Colonel Whitaker commanded, his voice firm. "No." The bikers hesitated, their eyes darting between the soldiers and Vince. For a moment it seemed like they might resist. But then one by one they dropped their weapons, their hands raised in surrender. Vince glared at Humphrey, his eyes filled with hatred. "This isn't over," he spat. "You'll regret this." Humphrey didn't respond. He just stood there, his chest heaving, his mind racing. He knew Vince was right. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the soldiers moved in to arrest the bikers, Humphrey felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Colonel Whitaker standing beside him, his expression a mix of concern and pride. "You did well, soldier," the colonel said. "But this is just the beginning. We need to be ready for whatever comes next." Humphrey nodded, his resolve hardening. He knew the road ahead would be tough. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had his fellow guards, his friends, and the Queen herself on his side. As he watched the bikers being led away, Humphrey couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, justice would prevail. But deep down he knew that the fight was far from over. The night was thick with tension as the Iron Skulls were escorted away from Windsor Castle. Humphrey watched from his post, his heart still pounding from the confrontation. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a heavy sense of unease. He knew Vince Harper wasn't the type to let things go. This wasn't over, not even close. As the soldiers disappeared into the distance with the bikers in tow, Humphrey turned to Tommy, who was still catching his breath. Tommy's face was pale, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a grim seriousness. "You all right?" Humphrey asked, his voice low. Tommy nodded, though his hands were trembling slightly. "Yeah, just didn't expect things to escalate like that. Those guys are insane." Humphrey clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "They're cowards," he said. "They only act tough when they're in a group. But don't worry, Tommy. We'll handle this." Tommy gave him a weak smile, but his eyes were filled with doubt. "I hope you're right, mate. I really do." The two guards stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the night pressing down on them. The castle grounds were eerily quiet now, the only sound the distant hum of the city. But the calm felt deceptive, like the stillness before a storm. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit police station on the outskirts of Windsor, Vince Harper sat in a cold, sterile interrogation room. His hands were cuffed to the table, but his expression was anything but defeated. He leaned back in his chair, a smug grin on his face as he stared at the two officers across from him. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a no-nonsense attitude, leaned forward. "You're in a lot of trouble, Harper," he said. "Assaulting a royal guard? That's not something we take lightly." Vince chuckled, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Oh, come on. You really think you can keep me here? I've got friends in high places, mate. I'll be out before you know it." The officer's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He knew Vince wasn't entirely wrong. The Iron Skulls had connections and Vince had a way of slipping through the cracks. But this time things were different. This time the Queen herself had witnessed the incident. The other officer, a younger woman with sharp eyes and a steely demeanor, spoke up. "You might want to rethink your attitude, Harper. This isn't just about you slapping a guard. This is about disrespecting the crown. Do you really think your friends are going to stick their necks out for you now?" Vince's grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But let me tell you something. If I go down, I'm taking that guard with me. He's not as innocent as he looks." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions wary. They knew Vince was trying to get under their skin, but they also knew there was a kernel of truth in his words. Humphrey Johnson was a good soldier, but no one was perfect. And if Vince had dirt on him, things could get complicated. Back at Windsor Castle, Humphrey was finally relieved from his post. He made his way to the barracks, his mind still racing. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder several times, but the courtyard was empty. Still the unease lingered. When he reached the barracks, he found a small group of guards gathered in the common room. They were talking in hushed tones, their faces serious. As soon as Humphrey walked in, the room fell silent. "What's going on?" Humphrey asked, his voice cautious. One of the guards, a man named Daniel Carter, stepped forward. "We heard what happened," he said. "Are you okay?" Humphrey nodded, though he could feel the weight of their stares. "I'm fine," he said. "Just a bunch of idiots trying to prove a point." Daniel hesitated, then glanced at the others before speaking again. "Look, Humphrey, we're all on your side, okay? But you need to be careful. These guys aren't just some random thugs. They're dangerous. Humphrey sighed, running a hand over his face. I know, he said. But what am I supposed to do? Just let them walk all over me? No one's saying that, Daniel replied. But you can't fight this alone. We're here for you, but you need to let us help. Humphrey looked around the room, seeing the concern in his fellow guard's eyes. For the first time since the incident, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe he didn't have to face this alone. Maybe, together, they could stand up to Vince and his gang. But before he could respond, the door to the common room burst open. A young guard, barely out of training, rushed in, his face pale and his breath ragged. Humphrey, he exclaimed. You need to come quick. There's something you need to see. Humphrey's heart skipped a beat. What is it? He asked, his voice tense. The young guard shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. I can't explain it. Just, come with me. Without hesitation, Humphrey followed the guard out of the barracks, the others close behind. They hurried through the castle grounds, the tension growing with every step. Finally, they reached the main gate, where a small crowd had gathered. As Humphrey pushed his way through the crowd, his blood ran cold. There, on the ground in front of the gate, was a single black rose. Attached to it was a note, written in bold, jagged letters. This isn't over. Watch your back. Humphrey stared at the note, his hands trembling. He knew exactly who it was from. Vince Harper wasn't just making threats, he was sending a message. And Humphrey had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. The black rose lay on the ground like a dark omen, its petals glistening under the pale glow of the castle's exterior lights. Humphrey stared at it, his mind racing. The note was clear, Vince Harper wasn't done with him. This wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration of war. The other guards gathered around, their faces etched with concern. Tommy was the first to break the silence. This is bad, he said, his voice low. Real bad. Humphrey nodded, his jaw clenched. Yeah, but we can't let him get to us. If we show fear, he wins. Daniel Carter, the guard who had spoken up earlier, stepped forward. Humphrey is right, he said. We need to stay calm and think this through. But we also need to be prepared. Vince isn't going to stop until he gets what he wants. And what does he want? Another guard asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Revenge, Humphrey replied simply. He wants to humiliate me, to make me pay for what happened. But I'm not going to let him. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. They all knew how dangerous Vince and his gang could be. But they also knew that Humphrey wasn't the type to back down. If there was going to be a fight, he would be at the forefront. The next morning, Humphrey reported for duty as usual, though the weight of the previous night's events hung heavily over him. He tried to focus on his tasks, but his mind kept drifting back to the black rose and the note. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something big. As he stood at his post, he noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was Colonel James Whitaker, the head of security at Windsor Castle. The colonel's expression was stern, his eyes sharp and calculating. Humphrey, he said, his voice firm. A word. Humphrey followed the colonel to a quiet corner of the courtyard, his heart pounding. He had a feeling he knew what this was about. I heard about the incident last night, Colonel Whitaker said, his gaze never leaving Humphrey's. And I saw the rose. This situation is escalating and we need to address it before it gets out of hand. Humphrey nodded, his mind racing. I understand, sir. But I'm not sure what more we can do. Vince Harper is a dangerous man, and he's not going to stop until he gets what he wants. The colonel's expression softened slightly. I know this isn't easy, Humphrey. But you're not alone in this. We're going to do everything we can to protect you and the rest of the guards. But I need you to be honest with me. Is there anything else I should know? Anything that might help us anticipate his next move? Humphrey hesitated, his mind flashing back to the confrontation with Vince. He mentioned something, he said slowly. He said if he goes down, he's taking me with him. He made it sound like he had something on me. The colonel's eyes narrowed. Do you have any idea what he might be referring to? Humphrey shook his head. No, sir. I've always tried to do my job to the best of my ability. I don't know what he could possibly have. The colonel studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right. We'll look into it. In the meantime, I want you to be extra cautious. Don't go anywhere alone and report anything suspicious immediately. Understood? Yes, sir, Humphrey replied, his voice steady. As the day wore on, Humphrey couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow, every sound seemed to carry a hidden threat. He tried to focus on his duties, but the tension was relentless. That evening, as he was preparing to leave the castle grounds, Tommy approached him. Hey, Humphrey, he said, his voice hesitant. I was thinking, maybe you shouldn't go home alone tonight. Why don't you stay at my place? Just until things calm down. Humphrey considered the offer. He knew Tommy was right, It wasn't safe for him to be alone. But he also didn't want to drag his friend into this mess. "I appreciate it, Tommy," he said. "But I can't ask you to do that. This is my fight." Tommy shook his head. "It's not just your fight, Humphrey. We're a team, remember? We look out for each other. And right now you need someone to have your back." Humphrey hesitated, then nodded. "All right. Thanks, Tommy." The two guards left the castle together, their senses on high alert. As they walked through the quiet streets of Windsor, Humphrey couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The town was usually peaceful, but tonight it felt different, like the calm before a storm. When they reached Tommy's apartment, they quickly locked the door and checked the windows. It was a small, modest place, but it felt safe. Tommy handed Humphrey a cup of tea, and the two men sat in silence for a while, each lost in their thoughts. Finally, Tommy spoke up. "Do you really think Vince will try something?" Humphrey sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know. But if he does, we need to be ready." Tommy nodded, his expression grim. "We will be. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The next morning, Humphrey woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing. He groggily reached for it, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the message on the screen. It was from an unknown number and it contained just 2 words. "Game on." Humphrey's blood ran cold. He knew exactly who it was from. Vince Harper wasn't just making threats, he was making promises. And Humphrey had a sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. The message on Humphrey's phone felt like a punch to the gut. Game on. 2 words, but they carried the weight of 1,000 threats. Humphrey sat on the edge of Tommy's couch, staring at the screen, his mind racing. Vince Harper wasn't just playing games, he was making it clear that this was personal. And Humphrey knew deep down that things were about to get a lot worse. Tommy walked into the room, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He took one look at Humphrey's face and immediately knew something was wrong. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tense. Humphrey handed him the phone without a word. Tommy read the message, his expression darkening. "This guy doesn't quit, does he?" he muttered. "What's his endgame? To scare you into quitting? To make you look over your shoulder forever?" Humphrey shook his head, his jaw tight. "I don't know. But I'm not going to let him win. Whatever he's planning, we need to be ready." Tommy nodded, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a steely resolve. "All right. Let's figure this out. But first we need to tell the Colonel. He needs to know what we're dealing with." An hour later, Humphrey and Tommy were back at Windsor Castle, standing in Colonel Whitaker's office. The Colonel listened intently as Humphrey explained the situation, his expression growing grimmer with each passing moment. "This is unacceptable," the Colonel said finally, his voice sharp. "Harper is escalating and we can't afford to take any chances. I'm going to increase security around the castle and assign a detail to watch over you, Humphrey. But I need you to be vigilant. If you see anything at all, you report it immediately. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Humphrey replied, his voice steady. The Colonel leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "There's something else we need to consider. Harper mentioned having something on you. Do you have any idea what that could be?" Humphrey hesitated, his mind racing. "I've thought about it, sir. But I can't think of anything. I've always tried to do my job to the best of my ability. I don't know what he could possibly have." The Colonel studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. We'll keep digging. In the meantime, I want you to stay close to the castle. No unnecessary risks." As the day went on, Humphrey tried to focus on his duties, but the tension was relentless. Every shadow, every sound seemed to carry a hidden threat. He could feel the eyes of the increased security detail on him, but it did little to ease his nerves. That evening, as Humphrey was preparing to leave the castle, he received another message. This time it was a photo. His heart sank as he opened it. The image showed his childhood home, a modest house in the Midlands where his parents still lived. The message below the photo was simple. Family first. Humphrey's hands trembled as he stared at the screen. Vince wasn't just threatening him anymore, he was targeting his family. Humphrey felt a surge of anger and fear, but he knew he couldn't let it consume him. He needed to act and fast. He immediately called his parents, his heart pounding as he waited for them to answer. When his mother's voice finally came through the line, he felt a small measure of relief. "Humphrey? Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "I'm fine, Mum," Humphrey said, trying to keep his voice calm. "But I need you and Dad to be careful. There's someone who might try to cause trouble. I need you to lock the doors, keep the windows closed, and call me if you see anything suspicious." "Okay." His mother hesitated, then nodded. "All right, Humphrey. We'll be careful. But what's going on? Are you in danger?" Humphrey sighed, running a hand over his face. "It's complicated. But I'm handling it. Just promise me you'll be careful. We will, his mother replied. You take care of yourself, Humphrey. We love you. I love you too, Mum, Humphrey said, his voice thick with emotion. After the call, Humphrey immediately went to find Tommy. He showed him the photo and the message, his expression grim. We need to do something, Humphrey said. I can't let him hurt my family. Tommy nodded, his face set in a determined frown. We'll figure this out. But we need to be smart about it. If we go charging in, we'll just be playing into his hands. Humphrey took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. You're right. But we can't just sit here and wait for him to make the next move. Tommy thought for a moment, then snapped his fingers. What if we set a trap? If we can lure him out, we might be able to catch him in the act. Humphrey raised an eyebrow. A trap? Oh. Tommy grinned, a spark of mischief in his eyes. We make him think he's winning. We give him what he wants, or at least what he thinks he wants. And when he takes the bait, we spring the trap. Humphrey considered the idea, his mind racing. It was risky, but it might be their best shot. All right, he said finally. Let's do it. But we need to be careful. Vince isn't stupid. Tommy nodded, his expression serious. We will be. But we need to move fast. If he's already targeting your family, we don't have much time. The two guards spent the next few hours planning their strategy. They knew they were taking a huge risk, but they also knew they couldn't afford to wait. Vince Harper was a dangerous man, and if they didn't stop him now, things would only get worse. As the night wore on, Humphrey couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest. He knew this was a gamble, but it was one he had to take. For his family. For his fellow guards. And for himself. Just before midnight, Humphrey sent a carefully worded message to the unknown number. It was short and to the point. You want me? Come and get me. He didn't have to wait long for a response. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed with a new message. Midnight. The old mill. Come alone. Humphrey showed the message to Tommy, his heart pounding. This is it, he said. The trap is set. Tommy nodded, his expression grim. Let's make sure it's one he can't escape from. The old mill stood on the outskirts of Windsor, its crumbling brick walls and broken windows casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. It was a place forgotten by time, a relic of the past that now served as a haven for those who preferred to operate in the shadows. For Humphrey, it felt like the perfect setting for what was about to unfold, a showdown that could change everything. Humphrey stood at the edge of the tree line, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come alone, just as Vince had demanded, but he wasn't unprepared. Hidden beneath his jacket was a small recording device, a gift from Tommy. If things go south, Tommy had said, we'll at least have evidence. Humphrey had agreed, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. As he approached the mill, he could hear the faint sound of voices inside. His stomach churned, but he forced himself to keep moving. He had to see this through. For his family. For his fellow guards. For himself. The door to the mill creaked open as Humphrey pushed it, the sound echoing through the empty space. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. The moonlight streaming through the broken windows illuminated the figures standing in the center of the room. Vince Harper was there, flanked by half a dozen members of the Iron Skulls. They were all armed, their faces twisted into cruel smirks. Well, Vince said, his voice dripping with mockery. Look who decided to show up. I was starting to think you'd chickened out. Humphrey took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room. He needed to buy time. I'm here, he said, his voice steady. Now let's talk. Vince laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Talk. Oh, this is rich. You think we're here to talk? No, mate. We're here to settle the score. Humphrey clenched his fists, his mind racing. He needed to keep Vince talking. What do you want, Vince? Revenge? Fine. Take it out on me. But leave my family out of this. Vince's smirk widened. Oh, I'll get to you, don't worry. But first, I want you to know what it feels like to lose everything. Starting with your precious family. Humphrey's blood ran cold. What are you talking about? Vince pulled out his phone and held it up, showing Humphrey a live video feed. The screen showed Humphrey's childhood home, his parents sitting in the living room, unaware of the danger lurking just outside. You see, Vince said, his voice filled with malice, I've got a few friends keeping an eye on your mom and dad. And if anything happens to me tonight, well, let's just say they won't be around to mourn you. Humphrey's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. He had to do something, anything, to protect his family. But he was outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options. Meanwhile, Tommy and a small team of guards were positioned just outside the mill, hidden in the shadows. They had been following Humphrey's every move, waiting for the right moment to strike. Tommy's earpiece crackled as one of the guards whispered, "We're in position. What's the plan?" Tommy hesitated, his eyes fixed on the mill. He could hear the tension in Humphrey's voice, the desperation. He knew they couldn't wait much longer. "We move on my signal," he said quietly. "But be careful. Vince has men inside and we don't know how many." The guards nodded, their expressions grim. They knew the risks, but they also knew they couldn't let Humphrey face this alone. Back inside the mill, Vince was growing impatient. "Enough stalling," he said, his voice sharp. "You've got two choices, mate. Either you walk out of here and never show your face again, or I make sure you and your family regret ever crossing me." Humphrey took a step forward, his eyes locked on Vince's. "You think you can scare me into running? You think I'm just going to let you win? You're wrong." Vince's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Brave words. But let's see how brave you are when you're staring down the barrel of a gun." He raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Humphrey. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Humphrey's mind raced, searching for a way out. But before he could react, a loud crash echoed through the mill. The door burst open and Tommy and the guards stormed in, their weapons drawn. "Drop your weapons," Tommy shouted, his voice filled with authority. Vince and his gang froze, their eyes wide with shock. For a moment it seemed like they might resist. But then one by one they dropped their weapons, their hands raised in surrender. Humphrey let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his shoulders slumping with relief. But the fight wasn't over yet. As the guards moved in to arrest Vince and his gang, Humphrey pulled out his phone and called his parents. His heart pounded as he waited for them to answer. When his mother's voice finally came through the line, he felt a wave of relief. "Humphrey? Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "It's over, Mum," Humphrey said, his voice steady. "You're safe now." His mother sighed, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank God. We were so worried." "I know," Humphrey replied. "But it's going to be okay. I promise." As the guards led Vince and his gang away, Tommy walked over to Humphrey, his expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "We did it," he said, his voice quiet. Humphrey nodded, his eyes fixed on Vince as he was shoved into a police van. "Yeah. But this isn't over." "Not yet." Tommy frowned. "What do you mean?" Humphrey turned to him, his expression grim. "Vince has connections. He's not going to stay locked up for long. And when he gets out, he's going to come after us. We need to be ready." Tommy nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then we'll be ready. Whatever it takes." As the night wore on, Humphrey couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. He knew this was just the beginning. Vince Harper was a dangerous man and he wasn't going to let this go. But Humphrey also knew that he wasn't alone. He had his fellow guards, his friends, and the unwavering support of the Queen herself. As he stood there watching the police van disappear into the night, Humphrey felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could win this fight. But deep down he knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. The days following Vince Harper's arrest were anything but calm. Humphrey felt like he was living in a strange limbo, relieved that Vince was behind bars but constantly on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. He knew Vince wasn't the type to stay locked up for long. The man had connections, resources, and a vindictive streak that ran deeper than the Thames. Humphrey couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The Royal Guard had increased security around Windsor Castle, and Humphrey was assigned a personal detail for his protection. It was a strange feeling being shadowed everywhere he went, but he understood the necessity. Vince had made it clear that Humphrey was his target, and until the threat was neutralized, no one could afford to let their guard down. One evening, as Humphrey was finishing his shift, Colonel Whitaker called him into his office. The colonel's expression was grave, and Humphrey felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach as he sat down. "We've received some troubling news," the colonel began, his voice low. "Vince Harper's lawyer has filed an appeal, claiming procedural errors during his arrest. The court has agreed to review the case, and there's a chance he could be released on bail." Humphrey's heart sank. He had known this was a possibility, but hearing it out loud made it feel all too real. "What does that mean for us?" he asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "It means we need to be prepared," the colonel replied. "If Vince is released, he'll come after you. And we can't let that happen. I've already spoken to the local authorities, and they've agreed to increase patrols around your parents' home. But you need to be extra cautious. No unnecessary risks. Understood?" Humphrey nodded, his jaw clenched. "Understood, sir." That night, Humphrey couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He thought about his parents, about the guards who had risked their lives to protect him, and about Vince Harper, who seemed to thrive on chaos and destruction. Humphrey knew he couldn't let Vince win. But he also knew that he couldn't do this alone. The next morning Humphrey sought out Tommy. He found him in the common room, sipping a cup of coffee and scrolling through his phone. Tommy looked up as Humphrey approached, his expression softening when he saw the look on his friend's face. "You all right, mate?" Tommy asked, his voice filled with concern. Humphrey shook his head, sitting down across from him. "Vince might be getting out on bail. The colonel told me last night." Tommy's eyes widened. "What? That's insane. After everything he's done?" "I know," Humphrey replied, his voice heavy with frustration. "But his lawyer's good. And Vince has friends in high places. We need to be ready for whatever happens next." Tommy leaned forward, his expression serious. "All right. What's the plan?" Humphrey hesitated, then took a deep breath. "We need to gather evidence. Something concrete that can put Vince away for good. If we can prove that he's a threat to the crown, the courts won't be able to ignore it." Tommy nodded, his eyes narrowing in thought. "All right. But how do we do that? Vince isn't exactly the type to leave a paper trail." "No," Humphrey agreed. "But he's arrogant. And arrogant people make mistakes. We just need to find one." Over the next few days, Humphrey and Tommy worked tirelessly to gather information. They reached out to contacts in the police force, reviewed security footage from the night of Vince's arrest, and even spoke to some of the townsfolk who had encountered the Iron Skulls. It was slow, painstaking work, but they were determined. One evening, as they were going through old police reports, Tommy stumbled across something interesting. "Hey, Humphrey," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "Take a look at this." Humphrey leaned over Tommy's shoulder, his eyes scanning the document. It was a report from a few months ago, detailing an altercation between the Iron Skulls and a local business owner. According to the report, Vince had threatened the man, demanding protection money in exchange for keeping his business safe. "This could be it," Humphrey said, his heart racing. "If we can get the business owner to testify, we might have a case." Tommy nodded, his expression grim. "But we need to move fast. If Vince gets wind of this, he'll shut it down before we even get started." The next day, Humphrey and Tommy tracked down the business owner, a man named Raj Patel. He owned a small convenience store on the outskirts of Windsor, and he had been living in fear of the Iron Skulls ever since the incident. At first, Raj was hesitant to talk. "I can't," he said, his voice trembling. "If Vince finds out I spoke to you, he'll destroy my business. Or worse." Humphrey leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Mr. Patel, I understand your fear. But if we don't stop Vince now, he's going to keep hurting people. You have the power to help us put him away for good. Please." Raj hesitated, his eyes darting between Humphrey and Tommy. Finally he nodded. "All right. I'll do it. But you have to promise me protection. For me and my family." "You have my word," Humphrey replied, his voice firm. With Raj's testimony secured, Humphrey and Tommy felt a glimmer of hope. They knew it wasn't enough to guarantee Vince's conviction, but it was a start. They just needed to keep digging to find more evidence that would make Vince's crimes impossible to ignore. But as they left Raj's store, Humphrey couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the street. There was no one there, but the unease lingered. That night, Humphrey received another message. It was from an unknown number just like before. But this time the message was different. "You think you're clever, don't you? But you're playing a dangerous game. And games have consequences." Humphrey's heart pounded as he read the message. Vince knew. Somehow he knew what they were doing. And if Humphrey didn't act fast, the consequences could be deadly. The message from Vince Harper burned in Humphrey's mind like a warning flare. Games have consequences. It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. Vince knew Humphrey was digging, and he wasn't going to sit back and let it happen. Humphrey felt the weight of the clock ticking down, each second bringing them closer to a confrontation that could change everything. The next morning, Humphrey and Tommy met with Colonel Whitaker to present the evidence they had gathered. The colonel listened intently as they laid out Raj Patel's testimony, the police reports, and the security footage from the night of Vince's arrest. When they finished, the colonel leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of pride and concern. "This is good work," he said finally. "But it's not enough. Vince Harper is a slippery man, and his lawyer will tear this apart in court. We need something undeniable. Something that leaves no room for doubt." Humphrey nodded, his jaw tight. "We're working on it, sir. But we're running out of time. If Vince gets out on bail, he's going to come after us. And he's not going to play fair." The colonel's eyes narrowed. "Then we need to be ready. I'll reach out to my contacts in the police and see if we can get more resources. But in the meantime, you two need to stay vigilant. Vince isn't going to stop until he gets what he wants." As Humphrey and Tommy left the colonel's office, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The castle grounds were quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. Every shadow, every sound seemed to carry a hidden threat. "We need to find something big," Tommy said, his voice low. "Something that ties Vince to the Iron Skulls and proves he's a danger to the Crown. But where do we even start?" Humphrey thought for a moment, his mind racing. Then it hit him. "The old mill," he said. "That's where Vince and his gang operate. If we can get inside, we might find something." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "You mean break in? That's risky, Humphrey. If we get caught, it could blow the whole case." "I know," Humphrey replied. "But we don't have a choice. If we don't act now, Vince is going to walk. And we can't let that happen." Tommy hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But we do this smart. No unnecessary risks." That night, Humphrey and Tommy made their way to the old mill. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the area in darkness. They moved silently, their footsteps barely making a sound as they approached the building. The door was locked, but Tommy had come prepared. He pulled out a set of lockpicks and went to work, his hands steady despite the tension. After a few tense moments, the lock clicked open. Humphrey and Tommy exchanged a glance, then slipped inside. The mill was exactly as Humphrey remembered it, dusty, decaying, and filled with shadows. But this time it felt different. There was an air of menace, as if the walls themselves were watching them. They moved carefully, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched for anything that could link Vince to the Iron Skulls. It was slow, painstaking work, but they didn't dare rush. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, Tommy found something. "Humphrey," he whispered, his voice filled with urgency. "Over here." Humphrey hurried over, his heart pounding. Tommy was standing in front of an old desk, its drawers pulled open. Inside were stacks of papers, photos, and what looked like financial records. "This is it," Tommy said, his eyes wide with excitement. "This is everything we need." Humphrey sifted through the documents, his hands trembling. There were records of illegal transactions, photos of Vince meeting with known criminals, and even a list of names, people who had crossed the Iron Skulls and paid the price. "This is it," Humphrey said, his voice filled with determination. "This is what we need to put Vince away for good." But before they could celebrate, a sound echoed through the mill. It was the creak of a floorboard, followed by the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. Humphrey and Tommy froze, their flashlights cutting through the darkness to reveal Vince Harper standing in the doorway, a gun in his hand and a cruel smile on his face. Well, Vince said, his voice dripping with malice. "Look who decided to drop by. I was hoping you'd show up." Humphrey's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "It's over, Vince," he said, his voice steady. "We've got everything we need to put you away for good." Vince laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You really think it's that easy? You think a few pieces of paper are going to stop me? You're even dumber than I thought." Tommy took a step forward, his hands raised. "It's not just the papers, Vince. It's over. You're done." Vince's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure hatred. "You're wrong. This isn't over. Not until I say it is." Before anyone could react, Vince raised his gun and fired. The sound echoed through the mill, deafening in the silence. Tommy cried out, clutching his shoulder as he fell to the ground. Humphrey's instincts kicked in. He lunged at Vince, tackling him to the ground. The gun skidded across the floor as the two men grappled, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Vince was strong, but Humphrey was fueled by adrenaline and determination. He managed to pin Vince down, his hands gripping the man's wrists as he struggled to keep him still. "It's over, Vince," Humphrey said, his voice filled with fury. "You're done." Vince snarled, his eyes filled with rage. But before he could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. The police had arrived. As the officers stormed the mill, Humphrey finally let go of Vince, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Tommy was helped to his feet, his shoulder bleeding but not life-threatening. Vince was handcuffed and led away, his face a mask of fury. Humphrey watched as Vince was shoved into a police car, his mind racing. It was over. Finally it was over. The aftermath of Vince Harper's arrest was a whirlwind of activity. The evidence Humphrey and Tommy had uncovered at the old mill was enough to bring down not just Vince, but the entire Iron Skulls gang. The police raided their hideouts, arresting dozens of members and seizing weapons, drugs, and stolen goods. It was a major victory, but Humphrey couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't entirely over. Vince was behind bars, but his influence still lingered. His lawyer was fighting tooth and nail to get him released, and Humphrey knew better than to underestimate the man's cunning. Vince had a way of slipping through the cracks, and Humphrey wasn't going to rest until he was sure the threat was gone for good. A few days after the raid, Humphrey was called to testify at Vince's bail hearing. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Humphrey sat in the witness box, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he answered the prosecutor's questions. He recounted everything, the threats, the assault, the evidence they had found at the mill. He spoke clearly and confidently, his voice steady despite the weight of the situation. But when Vince's lawyer took the stand, things took a turn. The man was slick, his words sharp and calculated. He tried to twist Humphrey's testimony, suggesting that Humphrey had a personal vendetta against Vince and that the evidence had been planted. "Isn't it true, Mr. Johnson," the lawyer said, his tone dripping with condescension, "that you have a history of conflict with my client? That this entire case is nothing more than a personal grudge?" Humphrey clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "No," he said firmly. "This isn't about me. This is about justice. Vince Harper is a dangerous man, and he needs to be held accountable for his actions." The lawyer smirked, clearly unimpressed. But before he could continue, the judge intervened. "Enough," she said, her voice sharp. "This line of questioning is irrelevant. The evidence speaks for itself." The bail hearing ended with Vince being denied bail, much to Humphrey's relief. But as he left the courtroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult battle. That evening, Humphrey met up with Tommy at a small pub near the castle. Tommy's shoulder was bandaged, but he was in good spirits, his usual cheerful demeanor shining through. "We did it, mate," Tommy said, raising his glass in a toast. "Vince is locked up and the Iron Skulls are finished. We should be celebrating." Humphrey nodded, but his expression was grim. "It's not over yet," he said. "Vince still has friends. And his lawyer is going to keep fighting. We need to be ready for whatever comes next." Tommy sighed, his smile fading. "I know. But we've got the evidence. We've got the truth on our side. What more can we do?" Humphrey hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice low. "We need to find Vince's weak spot. Something that even his lawyer can't spin. Something that proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he's a threat to the crown." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "And how do we do that?" Humphrey's eyes narrowed. "We go after his money. Vince might be a thug, but he's not stupid. He's got to be laundering his cash somewhere. If we can find where he's stashing it, we can cut him off at the knees." Tommy nodded, his expression serious. "All right. But where do we start?" Over the next few days, Humphrey and Tommy dug deeper into Vince's financial records. They worked tirelessly, following every lead, no matter how small. It was slow, painstaking work, but they were determined. Finally, they found something. A shell company registered under a fake name that had been funneling money to offshore accounts. It was a complex web of transactions, but Humphrey and Tommy were able to trace it back to Vince. "This is it," Humphrey said, his voice filled with excitement. "This is what we need." They presented the evidence to Colonel Whitaker, who immediately contacted the Financial Crimes Unit. Within hours, the authorities had frozen Vince's accounts and launched an investigation into his financial dealings. As the days turned into weeks, the case against Vince grew stronger. The evidence was overwhelming, and even his lawyer couldn't find a way to spin it. Vince was facing multiple charges, including assault, extortion, and money laundering. The trial was set to begin in a matter of weeks, and Humphrey felt a glimmer of hope. But as the trial date approached, Humphrey received a message. It was from an unknown number, just like before. But this time the message was different. "You think you've won. But the game isn't over. Not yet." Humphrey's heart pounded as he read the message. He knew it was from Vince, even though the man was behind bars. The threat was clear, and Humphrey couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The night before the trial, Humphrey couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He thought about everything they had been through, about the risks they had taken, and about the stakes of the trial. He knew this was their chance to finally bring Vince to justice, but he also knew that nothing was guaranteed. The next morning, Humphrey and Tommy arrived at the courthouse early. The building was surrounded by reporters and onlookers, all eager to catch a glimpse of the trial. Humphrey felt a surge of anxiety as he walked inside, but he forced himself to stay calm. The trial was long and grueling, with Vince's lawyer pulling out every trick in the book. But the evidence was undeniable, and the jury was clearly swayed. When the verdict was finally read, Humphrey felt a wave of relief wash over him. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in cheers, but Humphrey stayed silent. He looked over at Vince, who was being led away in handcuffs. The man's face was a mask of fury, but Humphrey didn't care. It was over. Finally, it was over. As Humphrey left the courthouse, he felt a sense of closure. Vince Harper was going to prison, and the Iron Skulls were finished. But as he walked through the streets of Windsor, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. There would always be more battles to fight, more injustices to confront. But for now he could rest.